Hello everybody, we're going to be looking at Psalm 34 in this Bible study. And I've chosen Psalm 34 because I think it suits perfectly this time we're in, this lockdown time. And Psalm 34 teaches us so much about fear. And I would describe it as an antidote to fear. David wrote it in probably the lowest point of his life. Lowest being, I suppose, his most dangerous phase of his life. And he faced many dangers and many troubles, did David. But this problem he had rose from fear, essentially. And what we learn from Psalm 34 is that it's important to respond to fear rather than react to it. And that's the main lesson we derive from Psalm 34. It's not a very long psalm, it's only about 22 verses, so I'm not going to grind you through hundreds of verses. You can pick it up, you can read it in about 10 minutes. And it's rich and packed with things to learn from it. But let me give you the historical context. And the context comes from, and this is what version is this? It's the New King James Version. 1 Samuel 21, and it starts at verse 10. And it's this, it says, "Then David arose and fled that day from before Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is this not David the king of the land?' Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s?' Now David took these words to heart, and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, 'Look, you see this man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?' And then he lets David go. You see, the historical context is this. David had been anointed to be the king, all well and good, and then he faces troubles. And the person who should have helped him, King Saul, the supposed man of God, the spiritual one, instead of helping him, decides to pursue him. And David ends up fleeing Saul, running away from his family and his best friend Jonathan, and he's now on the run. And he does the worst thing he could possibly do. He finds solace, or so he thinks, in the land of the Philistines in Gath. In other words, he puts his head in the tiger's mouth. He thinks it's a place of safety, but it's a place of acute danger. And that's where David finds himself. The craziest thing he could do was to put himself at the mercy of Israel's historical enemy. And he's there in Gath, saying to this hostile king, 'Please protect me.' Like I said, the head in the tiger's mouth. In other words, he reacts to his problems instead of responding to them. And I'm going to come to that theme, and I'll express that theme a bit more. And that's what this Psalm 34 really tells us. Is that when you live or react in fear, you get yourself into problems and difficulties. Right? So he's there now. He's at the mercy of this king. And he realizes the position he's put himself in. And he decides to act insane. And because of that, the king lets him go. See, this Philistine king, if he'd really thought about it, if he'd have known who David was, he could have packaged him up and sold him back to Saul as a ransom, made some money out of him. Or if he'd realized who David was to become, this marauding king of Israel, defeating his enemies, this king of Gath, this Philistine king, would have killed him. So this is the invidious position David finds himself in. And he put himself in this position. So what he does, he prays, and God gives him the answer to get out of this problem. So let's turn now to Psalm 34. And this is the Passion version. And I'm going to start at verse 4. And it says this: "Listen to my testimony." So he's speaking to us. He's saying to us, listen to my story, my testimony. "I cried to God in my distress, and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears. Gaze upon him, join your life with his, and joy will come. Your faces will glisten with glory. You'll never wear that shame face again. When I had nothing, desperate and defeated, I cried out to the Lord, and he heard me, bringing his miracle deliverance when I needed it most." And verse 7 is so beautiful, this, the way the Passion puts this. It says, "The angel of the Lord stooped down to listen as I prayed, encircling me, empowering me, and showing me how to escape. He will do this for everyone who fears God." Isn't that beautiful? What a story. So he's there, desperate, alone, defeated. And it's only then, strangely, that David decides to call on the Lord. You see, originally he'd reacted to his problems, and a reaction comes from the sort of effervescence of our emotions. We react in an instant as the adrenaline pumps through our body. It's a reaction. It's the fight or flight mechanism. David reacts in fear, and he runs away from his home, dragging, strangely, the large sword he'd used to kill Goliath with. And he reacts out of fear, and he puts himself into this terrible position. And he's in this position, and then he realizes, hang on a minute, I'm going to call on the Lord. And in his desperation, it's only then that he calls on God. And that beautiful line, "The angel of the Lord stooped down to listen as I prayed." And God gave David the answer. Now, some would say God would never tell David to feign madness, but it seems to me from the reading of these verses, that's what happened. He feigned madness, and he got out of this situation. He reacted. But when he prayed to God, God gave him the answer, and he responded. And the difference between reactions and responding is this. Reactions, as I've said, are fueled by fear, oftentimes. But responding to a situation comes from hearing the word of God. So take time and say, "Lord, help me, please. Show me what to do." And I've discovered with my life that when I've reacted in fear or anger, it never turns out well. But God just wants us to calmly just turn to him. "Lord, please help me." Not necessarily calmly, but turn to him. "Please help me." And God will give us that solution. That's what this psalm tells us. And we contrast this reaction of David with how he was later on, when he finds Saul in a cave. He's there hiding in the cave, this is David now, and Saul comes in, and he puts himself, without knowing it, into David's hands. Saul puts his head in the tiger's mouth. But David's learned the importance of responding rather than reacting. And he calmly looks at Saul and says, "No, I could kill my adversary right now if I wanted to. But to maintain my integrity, I'm going to let God sort that out for me." Now, the reacting David would have killed him and brought probably a whole shed load of trouble. But the responding David, the one who turns to God in peace, maintained his integrity and he allowed Saul to move on. See, that's what David has learned from this experience. And I pray that we learn from this psalm how to respond rather than react in fear. So that's the first point I want to bring. And interestingly, he says this in verse 4. Listen to my testimony. I cried to God in my distress, and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears. And this psalm tells us that it's not the circumstances that really are screwing us up. It's the fear which causes us to make wrong choices. You see, God had not freed David from his circumstances because Saul was still out there with his assassins and his spies still trying to get David. But David was full of joy, not because Saul had been eliminated, but because God had eliminated his fears. He'd freed him from his fears. And it seems to me, in this time of lockdown, the world is being fueled by fear. The fact that we're in lockdown tells us that we're afraid to go out in case we catch this virus. And there is so much anxiety out there. And all we need to do, it's not a simple thing, is to turn our anxieties and fears to God. And this is what Psalm 34 says. Turn your anxiety to the Lord. Wait patiently for him, and God will, 1, deliver us from your fears, but 2, give you the solution as well to what's ailing you and troubling you. So that's lesson number 1. Let's turn now to verse 12. And this is David again. He says, do you want to live a long, good life, enjoying the beauty that fills each day? That's a no-brainer, isn't it? Do you want to live a long, good life? Well, we do. Enjoying the beauty that fills each day. And life is so full of, well, it's been for me, stress, rushing around, that we forget that there's more beauty in the world than we ever imagined. And David is experiencing that beauty. We can never experience the beauty of life, the beauty of this world, if we're full of fear and anxiety. But David's been released from his fears. He can now smell the roses, smell the coffee, and enjoy his life. And he says this, if you want that, then never speak a lie or allow wicked words to come from your mouth. Keep turning your back on every sin and make peace your life motto. Practice being at peace with everyone. And that's verse 14. And that word peace is shalom. And shalom is a much richer word than peace. It encapsulates wholeness, well-being, safety, happiness, completeness, prosperity, to be content and to be tranquil. And if you live this life, David says, keep turning your back on every sin and make this life, this shalom life, your motto, then you will live a long and good life. That's what David's essentially saying. And he says, interestingly, practice being at peace with everyone. Make it your practice. Be unoffendable. Don't be offended by what people say. It's a wonderful message. And it's, again, coming from this little psalm, Psalm 34. And another way to describe shalom is to destroy the authority that binds to chaos. I've heard that being said. Shalom means destroy the authority that binds to chaos. And we are in chaotic times, it seems to me. Nobody knows what's going on. But when we seek God and we seek this shalom way of living, that chaos which the enemy wants to bring into our lives, a chaos burdened and fueled by fear, we can live without all of that chaos if we allow God to do it. And it's a real solace for us in this time of lockdown. You know, I've come to the position now where I restrict how much time I listen to lockdown news, because it seems to me to be so energized by fear that you sometimes go to bed thinking, oh my gosh, everything is falling apart here. But it's not, folks. As Psalm 34 tells us, shalom can be the way we could live if we just turn to the Lord. So that's point 2. Coming to the end quite soon, and this is verse 18. And it says, the Lord is close to all whose hearts are crushed by pain, and is always ready to restore the repentant one. Even when bad things happen to the good and godly ones, the Lord will save them and not let them be defeated by what they face. And God is not saying, or David's not saying through this psalm, that we're not going to face troubles and problems, but that when we face them, we can present God's face towards it. We can have the peace of God in these times. Even when bad things happen to the good and godly ones, the Lord will save them and not let them be defeated by what they face. And this is what happened to David. He was essentially in a very bad position, a very bad place. And he turned to the Lord, and God restored him. He changed his circumstances in that he took him from this Philistine king, but he changed his heart as well. That fear was no longer a problem. And when fear is no longer a problem, you can be bold and strong in God. So that's it, lovely folks. Read Psalm 34 and be encouraged. And it's headed up, in the Passion Version at least, Psalm 34, God's goodness. And we should expect the goodness of God. Brian, I just encourage us to pray. Turn to him in these times as the first port of call. Don't react, but simply respond as God speaks to us. It is a wonderful psalm, and it's the psalm for our times. God just helped David, but David went off after this psalm into more troubles. But he never forgot how God had restored him and saved him. Have a good day, and as they say, stay safe. All the best.